The North Sea lay silent that April morning, its grey surface unbroken except for the slow, rhythmic heaving of distant waves. Beneath it, a vessel moved unseen, a narrow metal coffin of steel and sweat, its crew sealed away from the light of the dying world above. The year was 1945. The war was nearly over. Yet here, in the depths, the men of U-1206 still lived and breathed as if history had not already condemned them. Inside the submarine, the air was thick, a mix of diesel, machine oil, and the stale tang of human presence. Every sound was amplified, the hum of motors, the soft metallic groans of pressure, the occasional distant crackle of radio static. 46 men inhabited this steel tube, their fates intertwined by duty, chance, and the blind will of war. At the command center stood Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt, a man of precision and restless intellect. He had joined the Kriegsmarine with ambition and idealism, but by now, both had worn thin. His face, usually stern and deliberate, carried the faint tension of a man who had seen too much logic fail against chaos. Around him, the crew performed their duties with mechanical discipline, yet beneath that discipline lurked the fatigue of men who knew the end was near, not just for them, but for the Reich itself. Far above them, Europe was burning. Cities had become ruins. The once proud Luftwaffe was grounded. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. But here, under the water, time seemed to stand still, as if the sea, ancient and indifferent, cared nothing for empires or ideologies. And yet, the sea watches. It always watches. The Type VIC submarine was considered a marvel of its time, sleek, efficient, deadly. It could remain submerged for long periods, travel great distances, and deliver torpedoes with ruthless accuracy. But as the war dragged on, so too did the push for more innovation, more efficiency. Every mechanism, every valve, every screw carried the weight of German engineering's obsession with perfection. Among these innovations was something seemingly trivial, a new high-pressure toilet system. A submarine's toilet was no small matter. At depths of 100 meters, even a simple flush became a complex operation. Waste had to be expelled without allowing seawater to flood back in, a delicate balance between human need and mechanical precision. The older systems required surfacing to flush properly, exposing the vessel to enemy radar and aircraft. But this new system, this was different. It allowed the crew to use the toilet safely even in the deep. It was a triumph of plumbing and pressure, a marvel of valves, levers, and seals, and like all marvels of engineering, it demanded respect. The manual for its operation was several pages long, filled with precise instructions and warnings. Only a specially trained engineer was supposed to use it, a man who understood the exact sequence of levers that stood between convenience and catastrophe. But war breeds fatigue. Fatigue breeds mistakes. In the mess hall, a few sailors sat hunched over their tin mugs, drinking weak coffee. One of them, a young machinist named Erich Weber, glanced nervously toward the ceiling as if expecting it to collapse at any moment. "You think we'll see home again?" he murmured. Another sailor laughed softly, shaking his head. "Home? What's left of it?" Their laughter was brittle, the kind that exists only to hold back dread. Somewhere near the engine room, a wrench clanged to the floor, echoing through the hull like a gunshot. And then came the captain's voice over the intercom, calm but firm. "Prepare for dive depth. Maintain radio silence." They descended, slowly, steadily, into the dark. At 100 meters below the surface, the outside world disappeared. The light dimmed to nothing, replaced by the humming heartbeat of machinery. The sea pressed inward on every plate, every seam. The men carried on, checking gauges, turning valves, whispering short commands. In that oppressive darkness, the line between discipline and fear blurred. What does a man think about when he's trapped beneath the ocean, when every breath depends on a machine that could fail at any moment? Does he think of duty, or home? Does he think of love, or survival? Or does he, perhaps, think only of the next moment, the next command, the the next meal, the next dive. Captain Schlitt walked the narrow corridor toward the officers' quarters. His boots echoed against the metal floor. In his hand, he carried a small notebook filled with calculations, fuel ratios, oxygen levels, time to return to port. Everything about him was methodical. Everything except the creeping thought that he would be remembered not for glory, but for futility. He paused by the control panel and watched a droplet of condensation slide slowly down the steel. He thought of the world above, of Germany's crumbling cities, of a furor raging in his bunker, of the illusion of order collapsing into dust. "Sir," said the chief engineer, appearing behind him. Depth holding steady. No external contacts. "Good," Schlitt said quietly. "Maintain course." Then he turned away, unaware that fate, at that very moment, was setting its own course, one not recorded in manuals or blueprints. In the cramped lower compartment, the so-called new toilet system gleamed with brass fittings and complicated levers. To the untrained eye, it looked less like a toilet and more like a piece of laboratory equipment. Pipes coiled like veins, connecting to tanks and pressure valves. A small plaque read, "For use by authorized personnel only." The irony was almost poetic. Later, some would say that Captain Schlitt himself decided to use it, an act born not of arrogance, but of simple human need. Others would claim he called for assistance, that the engineer made the fatal mistake. But who can say, truly? Memory under duress is an unreliable witness. What is certain is this: a valve was turned in the wrong sequence. Pressure built where it shouldn't have. And the sea, cold, patient, unfeeling, found its way in. But that moment had not yet come. For now, the crew of U-1206 continued their silent voyage beneath the waves, unaware that their story would soon become legend, not of heroism or victory, but of tragic irony. The omniscient narrator, were he to lean closer, might whisper. They were men of precision, undone by plumbing. And yet, is that not the essence of human history? The grandest designs laid low by the simplest faults? In the distance, sonar pings echoed faintly, enemy ships, perhaps, or the ghosts of other submarines lost before them. The men listened, tense. Every ping was a heartbeat in the dark. "Contact," someone whispered. "False alarm," came the reply. Just the sea talking back. But the sea does not talk. It listens. It remembers. And it waits. As night fell above the surface, a storm brewed, unseen by the men below. Lightning flickered across the horizon, momentarily illuminating the restless waters under which U-1206 crept forward. The submarine was a speck of human defiance in an ocean that had swallowed fleets, civilizations, and dreams. Inside, one sailor lay in his bunk, writing in a small journal. His handwriting trembled with the motion of the vessel. "If I do not return," he wrote, "perhaps someone will find this, and remember we were here. Not heroes, not villains, just men trying to breathe in a world that no longer wanted us." He closed the book, tucked it beneath his pillow, and closed his eyes. The engines thrummed softly, steady and low. And above them, the sea roared. War, at its core, is a contest not only of armies but of ideas. Every conflict becomes a race of invention, faster planes, stronger armor, smarter weapons. In that race, Germany had once led the world. From jet aircraft to rocket propulsion, the Reich's engineers turned imagination into steel. And deep beneath the waves, another form of genius thrived, one that sought to dominate the sea with machines both elegant and terrible. The U-boat, short for Unterseeboot, was the embodiment of that vision. To the German Navy, it was not merely a weapon, it was a symbol of precision, discipline, and national pride. Each submarine carried with it the mythology of superiority, a floating fortress of intellect and engineering. But pride, as history so often reminds us, is a fragile shield against folly. The Type VIC, to which U-1206 belonged, was hailed as the backbone of the German submarine fleet. Sleek and compact, it combined power and endurance in ways that stunned its adversaries during the early years of the war. It could dive to depths exceeding 200 meters and strike without warning. For a time, the Atlantic itself seemed to bow before the wolf packs of the Kriegsmarine. Yet by 1945, that age of supremacy had faded. Allied sonar, radar, and air patrols had turned the hunters into prey. Every U-boat that left harbor did so with the grim knowledge that it might never return. The sea had become a graveyard of steel. Still, innovation persisted. In the waning days of the Reich, German engineers pushed for every marginal improvement, anything that might give them one more breath of advantage, one more hour beneath detection. It was in this fever of invention that the high-pressure toilet was born. To the uninitiated, it seemed trivial. A toilet? In the midst of war? But for a submarine crew confined for weeks beneath the waves, sanitation was not a minor concern. Earlier models required surfacing to flush waste overboard, a dangerous maneuver that risked detection by enemy aircraft. Commanders had lost men, even entire boats, because of the need to relieve themselves. So, in theory, a deep-water flushing system made sense. It was practical, efficient, and a testament to German problem-solving. The new system was installed only on a handful of late-war U-boats, experimental, sophisticated, and notoriously temperamental. It functioned through a precise sequence of valves that balanced internal and external pressure. Waste would be sealed, compressed, and then expelled through the hull using compressed air, a ballet of engineering that worked flawlessly on paper. But in practice, it demanded near-perfect operation. Only trained engineers were authorized to use it. The manual read more like an instruction for launching a torpedo than flushing a toilet. One wrong valve, one incorrect pressure setting, and seawater, or worse, corrosive chlorine gas, could enter the hull. It was, in essence, a triumph of overdesign, a creation so complex that its usefulness teetered on the edge of absurdity. In the design rooms of Kiel and Hamburg, the engineers saw beauty in their diagrams. They spoke of efficiency and innovation, of mastery over pressure and flow. None of them thought of the weary sailor, half asleep after a 16-hour shift, fumbling with levers in the dark. None considered that war reduces even brilliance to chaos. And so it was installed, polished, certified, admired. U-1206 left the shipyard gleaming, her systems approved by bureaucrats who had long ceased to ask questions that mattered. She was to patrol the North Sea, harass Allied shipping, and if possible, intercept the convoys that supplied Britain's final push into Europe. But beneath the polished brass and gleaming metal, there was an invisible flaw, not in the machinery, but in the human confidence that built it. On board, life was a constant balance between monotony and terror. Every sound could be a threat, every silence, a warning. The men learned to trust their routines more than their senses. They cleaned, repaired, and checked, endlessly checked, the systems that kept them alive. The engines roared, the periscope rotated, the radio whispered through static. And always, the sea pressed closer, reminding them of its patience. The narrator, omniscient yet silent, might have smiled at the irony. That a nation capable of building rockets that touched the stratosphere had also built a toilet that could doom a submarine. Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt was no fool. He understood that war was no longer about victory, but about endurance. His orders were to patrol near the Scottish coast, to remain unseen, and to report Allied movement. It was a mission more symbolic than strategic, one final gesture of defiance from a nation drowning in its own ambition. The men respected him. He was strict but fair, composed but human. Unlike many officers hardened by ideology, Schlitt carried himself with quiet pragmatism. In another time, he might have been an engineer himself, the kind of man who admired precision for its own sake. On the 5th day of patrol, the sea was calm. Too calm, perhaps. The submarine glided silently through the depths, her crew lulled by the monotony of routine. The cook prepared thin soup, the radio operator scanned for faint Allied transmissions, and the engineer inspected the air compressors. The captain noted the coordinates, then retired briefly to his quarters. A man can face death daily and still find his undoing in the most ordinary of needs. No one knows precisely what led to the fatal decision. Perhaps the captain's stomach turned after days of rations. Perhaps he wanted to test the famed new system. Or perhaps it was simply convenience, a brief human act in the midst of inhuman war. He stepped into the small compartment, barely large enough to stand in. The walls were lined with pipes and valves, each marked with German script and arrows. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of oil and rust. He studied the controls for a moment, confident yet cautious. But the procedure was complex. One lever opened the internal valve. Another equalized pressure. A third discharged the contents through the outer hull. Miss one step, and the sea would find its way in. At some point, he called for assistance. An engineer, young, nervous, and exhausted, joined him. Together, they adjusted the valves. A hiss of air escaped, then a faint gurgle. Everything seemed normal. Until it wasn't. When the sea enters a submarine, it does not roar, it whispers. A faint sound, almost delicate, as though the ocean is sighing through the cracks of human arrogance. Then the pressure shifts. Water sprays, valves tremble, and the confined air becomes poison. Chlorine gas formed as seawater mixed with battery acid. The men coughed violently, eyes burning. Within seconds, the compartment filled with a choking mist. Someone shouted an alarm. The engineer fell, clutching his throat. Panic spread faster than the gas. They sealed the affected section, but the damage was done. U-1206 could no longer remain submerged. The captain ordered an emergency ascent, a desperate, deadly choice. To surface in daylight, in enemy waters, was to invite destruction. Yet there was no alternative. The sea had claimed the lower compartments, the air was unbreathable. Men stumbled through the narrow corridors, coughing, blinded by fumes. Above them, the engines groaned under sudden strain. And then, with a shudder that echoed through the hull, U-1206 broke the surface. The North Sea greeted her with cruel indifference. Waves crashed against her hull, the wind howling like laughter. Within minutes, British aircraft detected the surfacing vessel. Alarms blared. The men scrambled to man anti-aircraft guns, but the storm of bullets and bombs came too fast, too precise. The captain shouted orders, his voice lost in the chaos. The engineer, the same one who had helped him, lay unconscious below. The once proud submarine, symbol of German might, now flailed helplessly on the surface, half sunk and gasping. Several men jumped into the freezing water. Others clung to the deck, praying to gods they had long forgotten. The bombs fell closer, and then one struck near the bow. The explosion tore through the steel-like paper. The omniscient voice pauses here, not to linger on their suffering, but to reflect. How fragile is the boundary between control and catastrophe? Between the machine that serves us and the one that destroys us? Is it arrogance to master the sea, or madness to believe it can ever be mastered? In the chaos, Captain Schlitt made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He ordered the submarine scuttled, to prevent capture by the enemy. Explosives were set, the remaining crew evacuated. The sea boiled with the force of the blast. U-1206, once a marvel of engineering, sank beneath the waves it had dared to defy. 9 men were lost that day, some drowned, others overcome by gas. The survivors were rescued by British vessels, their faces pale and hollow. For them, the war ended not with glory, but with irony. A toilet had doomed a war machine. When the British interrogated Captain Schlitt, they were astonished by the story. It sounded absurd, even comical. A submarine, sunk by its own sanitation system? Yet the reports, the damage, the survivor testimonies all aligned. It was true. The Allies laughed quietly at the irony, but some engineers nodded in grim understanding. They knew too well that complexity, unchecked by humility, leads only to failure. Years later, when divers discovered the wreck of U-1206 off the coast of Scotland, they found her remarkably intact, her hull resting silently on the seabed, her secrets preserved in salt and darkness. The sea had claimed her, but not without leaving behind a warning. Even now, the question lingers. Was it the toilet that doomed U-1206, or the pride of those who believed perfection could exist beneath the waves? The morning of April 14, 1945, began like any other aboard U-1206, routine, gray, and filled with the dull rhythm of survival. The men woke in shifts, their bodies accustomed to the constant vibration of engines and the metallic taste of recycled air. There was no sunrise for them, only the dim flicker of electric bulbs straining to imitate daylight. The ocean outside was calm, but calm seas often concealed danger. They were positioned off the northeast coast of Scotland, within striking range of Allied convoys that supplied Britain's final offensive push into Europe. The war above was almost over, but beneath the surface, these men still lived inside a machine that refused to admit defeat. Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt stood at the periscope, his expression unreadable. The sea, gray and infinite, reflected in the glass. He adjusted the focus, scanning the horizon for shadows that might betray ships or aircraft. The silence was deceptive. Somewhere above, Allied patrols scoured the waves, their radars sweeping like invisible blades. One signal, one wrong sound, could summon death. And yet, routine continued. Orders were issued. Gauges checked. Engines maintained. Life inside a submarine was both mechanical and intimate. Every movement was rehearsed, every breath shared. The men slept in narrow bunks, often in shifts. Some read small, battered books, others wrote letters they might never send. The air was heavy with oil, sweat, and resignation. After years of war, there was no illusion of heroism left, only the mechanical persistence of survival. The youngest crew member, Seaman Otto Klein, barely 20, often stared at the ceiling when off duty, listening to the faint groan of the hull. He imagined it as the sea whispering against the metal, testing for weakness. Sometimes he thought he could hear voices in it, echoes of lost submarines, trapped in the dark. He told no one, such talk was bad luck. Superstition ran deep among men who lived inside steel under pressure. In the cramped galley, the cook prepared breakfast, a thin barley porridge, rationed bread, and black coffee so bitter it felt like punishment. Conversation was minimal. The war had taught them silence. Yet, among the murmurs, one topic always surfaced: home. What would they return to, if they returned at all? Germany was collapsing, the radio carried nothing but coded fragments and the voice of defeat. Think they'll surrender soon? Weber, the machinist, asked quietly. Maybe, said another. But not before we drown. Their laughter was hollow, but laughter nonetheless. At 9:30, the captain convened his officers. The orders were clear: patrol the designated grid, remain submerged during daylight, surface at night to recharge batteries. Enemy aircraft had been reported nearby. The sea was no longer a friend, it had become a waiting graveyard. By midday, tension settled over the crew like a fog. Every man felt it, the uneasy awareness that something intangible was wrong. There were no alarms, no malfunctions, just a strange heaviness in the air, as if the ocean itself had grown expectant. The omniscient narrator, were he to step into that dim control room, would see not a collection of soldiers but a collection of souls, each carrying the invisible weight of inevitability. The machinery hummed, the valves hissed, and the seconds passed like slow, measured heartbeats. In the aft section, Chief Engineer Hans Meyer inspected the complex systems that governed air pressure and ballast. He was a meticulous man, the kind who spoke little and trusted gauges more than words. It was he who had received special training on the new deep-sea toilet system, a marvel of engineering that only he fully understood. He had explained its operation to the captain once, in technical terms. "It is simple, if you respect the sequence," he had said. But nothing aboard a submarine was ever simple. At 1300 hours, U-1206 leveled off at a depth of 55 meters. The engines purred softly. Outside, the sea pressed with quiet, crushing patience. The captain made his rounds, checking each compartment, nodding to the men, offering silent reassurance. He was respected. Even liked. But command was a lonely occupation. Every decision, however small, carried the potential for catastrophe. As he passed through the narrow corridor leading to the officers' quarters, he paused beside the sealed compartment that housed the infamous, high-pressure, toilet. It gleamed faintly under the electric light, a reminder of modernity in a place that otherwise felt medieval. The plaque on the wall read, in precise lettering, "Nur für Fach Personal, only for trained personnel." The captain smiled faintly. How absurd that such a thing required special expertise. He moved on, unaware that fate had already written his next act. By late afternoon, the mood aboard had shifted. The air was thick, the carbon dioxide scrubbers were overdue for adjustment. A few men complained of headaches. The sea outside remained deceptively calm, but on sonar, faint echoes murmured, distant propellers, perhaps Allied ships, perhaps nothing. Captain Schlitt ordered a shallow dive to avoid detection. The descent was smooth, mechanical. Gauges ticked downward. The sea grew darker. In the control room, the sound of water pressure intensified, a deep, almost imperceptible vibration that could unsettle even the most seasoned sailor. When they reached 80 meters, the lights flickered. Just once. Then steadied. The engineer noted it, but said nothing. A flicker meant nothing, until it meant everything. At 1800 hours, the captain, fatigued and aching, returned to his quarters. He removed his cap, set it on the small desk, and sank onto the narrow bench. The sound of engines was a constant lullaby. He reached for his logbook and began to write. The entries were brief, almost terse. Patrol continues. No contact. Crew morale fair. He paused, then added, equipment functioning well. Minor pressure fluctuation. Will monitor. He closed the log. For a long moment, he sat in silence, listening to the deep hum around him, the metallic heartbeat of a living machine. Then, with the absent-mindedness of exhaustion, he made a decision that would change everything. He stood, stepped toward the small compartment marked Sanitaraum, and opened the door. The air inside was cold. The pipes gleamed. It was, by all accounts, a simple human moment, one man seeking brief relief from the weight of command. He turned one valve. Then another. A hiss of air escaped. The system began its sequence. But one valve, perhaps two, were not in their proper position. A sound followed. Soft at first, like a sigh. Then sharper. A gurgling hiss that did not belong. The captain froze. "Engineer," he called. Within seconds, Hans Meyer appeared, already sensing the problem. "Stop. Don't touch anything," he shouted, rushing to the controls. He adjusted a lever, cursed under his breath. But it was too late. The pressure equalization had failed. The sea had found an opening. A violent burst of water erupted, slamming against the metal bulkhead. The engineer staggered, coughing as seawater splashed into the compartment. But worse was coming. As the flood mixed with battery acid from the adjacent compartment, a noxious cloud began to form. Chlorine gas. Invisible death. "Close it. Close it now," someone yelled. They sealed the door, but the gas was already spreading through the ventilation ducts. Men began coughing, choking, their eyes burning. Panic surged. Orders were shouted, repeated, lost in the chaos. The once precise machine of war had become a cage of confusion. Captain Schlitz staggered to the control room, face pale, throat raw. "Emergency ascent," he commanded. "Surface. Now." The ballast tanks were blown. Compressed air roared through the pipes. The submarine shuddered violently as it began its desperate rise. Every man held on to something: pipes, rails, faith. The pressure shifted, the hull creaked like a living thing in pain. Then, with a sudden lurch, they broke through. The surface. The sea. They gasped for air as hatches opened, but salvation was fleeting. Above, the sky was not empty. A British patrol aircraft spotted the rising vessel within minutes. Sirens wailed. The men scrambled to man their guns, but the deck was slick, the wind fierce. Enemy aircraft. Bearing 270. Bullets rained down like steel rain. Explosions tore through the water around them. The submarine rocked violently. One gunner was hit, thrown backward into the sea. The captain gave the only order left to give. Abandon ship. Men leapt into the freezing waves, their screams swallowed by wind and water. The ocean that had hidden them now became their executioner. Inside, the engineer triggered the scuttling charges. A final act of defiance. Moments later, the explosion tore through the hull. The submarine groaned, tilted, and began to sink, bow first, into the cold, dark silence it had once called home. U-1206 disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only oil, debris, and the faint echo of human error. 9 men never resurfaced. The survivors were hauled from the icy water by British patrol boats, half dead and shivering. Among them, Captain Schlitz stared blankly at the gray horizon. His face was expressionless, but inside him, something had broken. He knew the war was lost. But worse, he knew that his command, his machine, had been undone not by the enemy, but by a valve, a flush, and the eternal arrogance of human invention. The North Sea lay restless beneath a bruised sky, its waves folding and unfolding like the slow breathing of something ancient. U-1206 drifted near the surface now, crippled but not yet dead. Inside the steel carcass, the air was thick with the sour sting of chlorine, the metallic taste of fear. Lights flickered. The engines coughed. The submarine was no longer a machine of war, it was a wounded beast, groaning in the dark. The captain moved through the corridor, coughing into the crook of his arm. His lungs burned. The smell of acid clawed at his throat. "Seal off Section 3, he shouted, voice hoarse. Men obeyed blindly, slamming wheel valves shut, locking doors that would never open again. Behind those doors, the sea continued its invasion, slow, unstoppable, cold. The engineer, Hans Meyer, staggered toward the control room, his face pale, uniform soaked. "Pressure's rising in the aft tanks," he rasped. "The valves are jammed. We can't hold depth." The captain's eyes flicked to the gauges. Needles trembled near the red. "Then we surface," he said. "We'll breathe air or drown trying." The order rippled through the boat like a pulse. Hands turned levers, air hissed through pipes, ballast tanks blew. The submarine lurched upward. The sound was immense, a deep metallic roar as compressed air fought the weight of the ocean. Every man felt it in his bones, the war between air and water, life and death. Then came the moment of weightlessness, the surge as the vessel broke free. The hull burst through the surface with a thunderous gasp, throwing sheets of water skyward. Sunlight stabbed through the periscope lenses, dazzling eyes accustomed to darkness. For the first time in days, they saw the open world, and with it, danger. Above them, the sea stretched to every horizon, gray and pitiless. The wind howled. Rain slashed sideways. Somewhere beyond sight, Allied radar screens registered a new echo, a surfaced U-boat. In less than 10 minutes, the hunters would come. Inside, chaos continued. The gas lingered, hissing through the vents. 2 men lay motionless near the lower compartments, victims of poison and pressure. Others coughed violently, eyes streaming tears they could not stop. Ventilation. Meyer gasped. We must clear the air. But the fans had failed, power fluctuated with every surge of the main batteries. Sparks spat from a control panel. The submarine trembled again. Engines to half power, the captain ordered. Keep her steady. Sir, what if they spot us? They will, Schlitz said flatly. We have no choice. He stepped to the periscope, scanning the waves. Nothing yet, only the cold expanse, indifferent and infinite. But he could feel them coming. He had been hunter once, now he was prey. At 14:15, the radio operator reported faint Allied chatter. The enemy was close. The captain ordered the crew to prepare for engagement, though every man knew it was hopeless. Their guns were outdated, their ammunition low, their morale broken. Yet they followed orders, because orders gave structure to fear. The deck hatch opened with a heavy clang, letting in a blast of freezing wind. Sailors climbed the ladder, emerging into the gray daylight. The sea tossed them like toys. Waves crashed against the hull, foaming white around their boots. They loaded ammunition, manned the twin-barreled flak gun, and scanned the horizon. The first aircraft appeared minutes later, a black speck that grew larger with each heartbeat, wings slicing through cloud. Spitfire, someone whispered. Then another, and another. The captain joined them on deck, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The cold air burned his lungs, but it was pure compared to the poison below. Hold your fire until they dive, he commanded. The men nodded, gripping the cold metal of their weapons. The engines roared as the submarine fought to keep steady against the wind. Waves slapped its sides like taunts. And then, the attack came. The sky split open with the shriek of descending engines. Bullets ripped across the water, cutting white scars through the sea. The flak gun answered, spitting bursts of flame. The recoil shook the deck. Shell casings clattered across wet steel. The first plane swept past, so low they could see the pilot's goggles. The roar drowned out everything, orders, prayers, screams. The second aircraft released depth charges that plunged into the waves behind them, detonating seconds later with thunderous force. The submarine jolted violently, men were thrown to their knees. Saltwater sprayed over the deck. The smell of burning oil filled the air. Below deck, the remaining crew fought a different battle. Water poured through ruptured seals, the gas still lingered in corners. One man tried to reach a fallen comrade, but slipped and vanished beneath the rising flood. The engineer slammed shut another valve, his fingers bleeding. It's no use, someone shouted. We're finished. Meyer ignored him. We can still scuttle her, he said, voice trembling. Better we end her than let them take her. The captain heard him from the conning tower. For a moment, the words hung between them, heavier than the sea. To surrender meant capture and humiliation, to scuttle meant death, but on their own terms. He looked up. Another plane was diving straight toward them, machine guns blazing. Metal screamed as bullets tore through the hull. The gunner beside him fell backward, blood splattering across the deck. The captain's jaw tightened. Do it, he said. Set the charges. The engineer obeyed without hesitation. He raced below, through corridors filled with smoke and water, to the demolition panel. His hands shook as he armed the detonators. The timer ticked, a slow, merciless rhythm. 10 minutes. Enough time, perhaps, for those on deck to abandon ship. Not enough for all. The captain gathered the surviving crew. Overboard, he shouted. Swim clear of the hull. The men hesitated. The sea below was black and freezing. To enter it was to GA. The sea closed around them with a violence that stole breath and thought alike. Icy water swallowed every sound until only the drumming of waves and the rasp of human gasps remained. The men of U-1206 kicked toward the surface, lungs screaming, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Some clutched fragments of wood or twisted metal, others simply floated, stunned, the salt stinging their open mouths. The submarine hung half-submerged behind them, its gray hull glistening with oil, a leviathan bleeding from unseen wounds. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and death. A faint ticking echoed inside its frame, the timer counting down. 10 minutes, then less. Captain Schlitt treaded water, eyes fixed on his boat. Around him, his crew coughed and cried out, their words lost to wind. He could taste the bitterness of chlorine still burning his throat. "Hold on to something," he shouted, though he knew there was little to hold on to except faith. A young sailor beside him muttered a prayer, half-remembered, half-hopeless. Far above, the British planes circled back, glinting silver in the dim light. They saw the men scattered like dark specks on a cold gray canvas. The pilots hesitated only a moment, then swooped low once more, guns flashing. Bullets punched into the water, sending fountains of spray into the air. Schlitt ducked instinctively, feeling the shock of passing rounds. The ocean became a storm of lead and salt. Somewhere to his right, a cry was cut short. He turned, saw nothing but red blooming in the waves. Why, he thought. Why must war follow even into the water? The thought vanished beneath the roar of an explosion. The charges had detonated. The submarine convulsed as if alive, splitting from within. A column of water rose hundreds of feet into the air, lifting debris and men alike. The shockwave hurled Schlitt backward. When the spray cleared, U-1206 was gone. Only fragments remained, metal, oil, and silence. The captain blinked against the stinging rain, searching for survivors. A few figures still moved in the water, calling weakly. The others were gone, taken by depth and cold. He forced himself to swim toward the nearest man, dragging him by the collar toward a floating section of hull. "Stay awake," he said, though the sailor's eyes were already glazing over. The cold was merciless. Muscles stiffened, thoughts slowed. The sea, once an adversary, now felt almost merciful in its numbness. Above, the British planes turned away, mission complete. The hunters left their prey to the elements. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, time fractured under hypothermia's grip. The storm eased slightly, leaving a long, rolling swell that carried the survivors farther from the wreck. Schlitt's hands were raw, fingers bleeding from clutching the sharp edge of the debris. He looked toward the horizon where the gray met the gray and wondered if rescue would come, or if this was how men disappeared, unmarked, unnamed. Dissolved into the water that had defined their lives. Did arrogance bring us here, he thought. A toilet, a symbol, a mistake. The absurdity of it pressed down harder than the waves. To think that a marvel of engineering, a submarine designed to stalk the seas, had been undone by the very system meant to civilize it, a mechanism for comfort. Somewhere deep beneath them lay the remains of that invention, now crushed under pressure. The narrator's voice, had there been one, would have whispered of irony too heavy for words. But here, only the sea spoke. Hours later, as night approached, a shape appeared on the horizon, a trawler, British, its silhouette dark against the fading sky. A lookout spotted movement among the waves. "Survivors," he called. The ship turned, engines churning white foam. Rescue nets were thrown, voices shouted across the cold void. Schlitt barely felt the hands pulling him aboard, the warmth of the deck seared his frozen skin. He collapsed, coughing seawater, vision narrowing to a tunnel. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the flicker of a lantern swinging in the wind, reflected in the puddles on the deck, tiny lights trembling over a sea that had claimed so much more. When he awoke, he was in a cabin, wrapped in blankets. The rhythmic hum of the trawler filled his ears, steady, indifferent. A British officer stood beside him, clipboard in hand. "Name?" the man asked. "Karl Adolf Schlitt," he croaked. The officer raised an eyebrow, jotting the name down. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, not unkindly. "Most aren't." Schlitt nodded faintly. Words meant little now. His mind wandered back to the faces of his crew, to the sound of rushing water and the smell of burning oil. He thought of the young sailor who had prayed and of the engineer who had set the charges. Were they somewhere beneath him now, suspended in the black silence, or had the sea already taken even their memory? The officer closed his notebook. "Rest. We'll reach Aberdeen by dawn." Schlitt turned his head toward the porthole. The sea outside was calmer now, rippling under a sickle of moonlight. He watched it, hypnotized. Somewhere down there lay his ship, his men, and the cruel absurdity of their fate. He wondered if history would even remember U-1206, or if it would be swallowed by the same indifference that had devoured so many stories before. The trawler's engine throbbed through the hull like a slow heartbeat. Each pulse seemed to say the same thing: survive, remember, atone. And yet, he knew memory was fragile. The war was ending, new tragedies would soon replace the old. The sea, however, would remember everything. It always did. Dawn came slow and gray over the North Sea, dragging a thin line of light across the endless horizon. The trawler cut through the water at steady pace, its wake a long white scar trailing into mist. On the deck, Karl Adolf Schlitt sat wrapped in a coarse blanket, his eyes hollow, his skin waxen from cold and exhaustion. Around him, the surviving crew of U-1206 huddled in silence. Their faces were pale, lips blue, expressions vacant. None spoke. Words had no meaning after what they had seen. The British sailors, hardened men used to loss and salvage, moved quietly among them, offering tin cups of tea and thin slices of bread. The smell of fuel and salt mingled with the faint sweetness of the brew. Schlitt took the cup, sipped once, then stared into it as though trying to read the future in the ripples. He could still hear the sea exploding behind his eyelids, the hiss, the roar, the final crack of metal surrendering. "Do you ever wonder," he thought, "how something so small, so trivial, could end everything?" The question circled in his mind like a gull in storm wind. He had been trained to command steel, to calculate distance, to measure risk. But no training could prepare a man for irony. A toilet, an invention of human convenience, had undone what torpedoes and depth charges could not. He thought of the engineer, Hans Meyer, of the way his hands trembled as he turned the valves. He had followed orders, done everything right, and still it had ended in poison and ruin. Schlitt's chest tightened. Was it his fault? His arrogance? His curiosity? History would judge him, but history had not been there, in the stink, the panic, the gas. He had made a choice, and the sea had answered. The British officer approached again, the same man from the night before. "Captain Schlitt," he said evenly, "will reach Aberdeen within the hour. You'll be handed over to intelligence for questioning." Schlitt nodded, eyes still on the cup. "Questioning," he murmured. "Yes, of course. There will be questions." The officer hesitated, studying him. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I've seen men go down for less. You brought some of yours back alive. That counts for something." Schlitt looked up. The officer's tone carried no mockery, only a weary respect that crossed enemy lines. But Schlitt could not feel gratitude. The weight of the dead pressed too heavy on his chest. "I brought them back," he whispered, "but not all." The officer said nothing more. He simply nodded and walked away, leaving Schlitt alone with the sea. The shoreline came into view soon after, a pale smear of grey and green through the fog. Scotland. Safe land, yet alien. The survivors watched it grow larger, but none smiled. They had escaped drowning only to face captivity, interrogation, and shame. The trawler moored in the harbor, where soldiers and medics waited. Cameras clicked in the distance, reporters eager for stories of surrender. U-boat survivors, one shouted, from the sea near. Peterhead. Schlitt turned away from the flash. The humiliation bit deeper than the cold ever had. He thought of the men still trapped below, their bones already claimed by the deep. Would they be remembered as heroes or as fools undone by plumbing? He did not know which was worse. The prisoners were led ashore, their boots leaving wet prints on the wooden planks. The air smelled of coal smoke and fish oil. Above them, gulls screamed, a chorus of the living mocking the ghosts. Inside a stone building near the pier, Schlitt sat before a table under harsh light. Across from him sat two British intelligence officers, notebooks open. One lit a cigarette, the smoke curling lazily between them. "Captain Schlitt," the first said, "we'd like you to describe the circumstances of your vessel's loss." He paused, pen poised. "Start from the beginning." Schlitt stared at the wall behind them, where the paint peeled in strips like old skin. "It was the toilet," he said at last. The officers exchanged a glance. "The toilet?" "Yes," he said, his voice flat, stripped of all pretense. "An advanced model. Pressure operated. Complicated enough that only trained engineers could use it properly. I used it wrong." He paused. "And the sea came in." Silence followed. The second officer leaned forward slightly. "You're saying your submarine was destroyed because of plumbing?" Schlitt nodded. There was no bitterness in his voice, only exhaustion. "Because of arrogance," he corrected softly. "We built machines too clever for their own good. We trusted them more than we trusted sense." The first officer tapped his pen against the paper. "And when the flooding began?" "Chlorine gas," Schlitt said. "We surfaced to ventilate. Then your planes found us." After that, he let the words trail away. The officer wrote something down, then looked up. "You realize, Captain, this story will be difficult for your command to explain." Schlitt's lips twisted into something that was almost a smile. "There is no command left to explain it." The officers exchanged another glance, then stood. "That will be all for now," one said. "You'll be moved to a holding facility near Inverary. Get some rest." Rest. The word felt foreign. He nodded once. When they left, the room seemed to shrink around him. He leaned forward, head in hands, and for the first time allowed himself to breathe without command or witness. In that stillness, the memories came back sharper, the hiss of air through ruptured pipes, the shouts of men sealing bulkheads, the green tint of light through poisoned mist. He saw Hans Meyer again, face streaked with soot, eyes alive with terror and resolve. "Do it," the captain had said. "Set the charges." And Meyer had obeyed. Schlitt wondered if the engineer's last thought had been of his family or of the machine that killed him. Outside, the wind howled over the harbor, rattling windows. The sea was only a few hundred meters away, invisible behind the fog, yet its presence filled the room. Night fell over Aberdeen with the soft hiss of rain against glass. Inside the barracks, the captured crew of U-1206 slept restlessly, twisting in their bunks, haunted by sounds only they could hear. The rhythmic drip of water from a leaking pipe became, in dreams, the steady seep of seawater through steel. The faint hum of the generator turned into the growl of diving engines. Every man carried the ocean inside him now, a shadow that would never lift. Captain Schlitt lay awake, eyes tracing the patterns of condensation on the ceiling. He had been through interrogation, paperwork, and the indignity of being photographed beside his captors. Yet what truly kept him from sleep was not shame, it was memory. He remembered the moment the sea breached his command. He remembered how it had sounded, alive, like an animal freed from its cage. He had seen fear in men's eyes before, but never like that day, raw, primal, without the illusion of glory. War stripped away reason, but drowning stripped away everything else. He thought of the young sailor who had whispered a prayer before the explosion. The boy couldn't have been more than 19. "I will carry your prayer," Schlitt thought, though he no longer believed in any god who answered such things. The rain grew heavier, a soft percussion on the tin roof. Somewhere, a guard coughed. The sound of boots echoed in the corridor. The war outside these walls was ending. Germany had fallen, the radios whispered of surrender. The world was already moving past them. They were relics of a doomed machine. Yet for Schlitt, the war would never truly end. It would live in the spaces between thoughts, in every silent moment when memory rose like a tide. He turned onto his side, staring at the faint light bleeding through the window bars. Beyond that gray glow lay the sea, cold, infinite, and patient. It had taken his command, his men, and his certainty. But it had left him alive. Why? He did not know. Perhaps survival itself was punishment. Weeks passed. Interrogations dwindled. The British found little of tactical value in the story of U-1206. It was an embarrassment more than intelligence, a cautionary tale about the arrogance of innovation. Reports were filed, sealed, forgotten. The crew was transferred to a POW camp inland, far from the water. Fields of heather stretched for miles under the Scottish sun. The men adjusted to their captivity with the dull rhythm of repetition, roll call, meals, work details. To the guards, they were just another group of defeated soldiers. But inside the barbed wire, the ghost of the submarine lingered. At night, they spoke softly among themselves, voices carrying through the barracks like distant sonar. They spoke of the engineer, of the explosion, of the strange peace that followed. Sometimes they even laughed, a dry, broken laughter that ended too quickly. One evening, as the sky burned orange over the hills, a British chaplain visited the camp. He offered books, prayers, comfort. Schlitt watched him from a distance, curious but unmoved. Later, the chaplain approached him directly. "Captain," he said gently, "would you like to talk?" Schlitt regarded him with tired eyes. "Talk about what?" "About loss," the chaplain said. "About forgiveness." The captain's lips twitched. "Forgiveness," he echoed. "For a toilet." The chaplain frowned slightly, unsure if it was mockery. Schlitt sighed. "You wouldn't understand. It wasn't the machine's fault. It wasn't mine, either. It was everything. Pride. Fear. The sea doesn't forgive, Father. It just takes." The chaplain nodded slowly. "And yet you lived." "Yes," Schlitt said, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "That's the cruelest part." The chaplain said a quiet prayer and left him there, standing in the amber light. That night, the wind howled through the camp fences. The prisoners slept fitfully, dreaming of depth and darkness. Schlitt dreamed too, of sinking again, only this time there was no fear. He saw his men waiting below, pale faces lit by phosphorescent light. They did not speak, but their eyes were clear. He felt the pressure on his chest, the weight of water closing in. And in that dream, he welcomed it. When he awoke before dawn, the barracks were silent. A faint mist crept through the cracks in the window. He sat up slowly, heart pounding from a sorrow he could not name. He looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, still trembling. What will history say? He wondered aloud. That we were fools? That we were monsters? Or that we were men who simply made one mistake too many? No one answered. The room smelled of damp wood and rusted metal. Outside, a bell rang for morning roll call. Life continued, mechanical and indifferent, just as the U-boat once had. Yet somewhere deep inside him, a voice whispered that the story of U-1206 was not truly over. One day, the sea would reveal her again. Metal does not forget. It waits. The days at the POW camp blended together in a muted gray. Breakfast, roll call, work details, dinner, sleep, each repeating with a mechanical certainty that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the sea. Schlitt moved among the prisoners with a quiet, detached authority, his presence a subtle anchor for the younger men who had survived the disaster. Though his face showed exhaustion, his eyes remained alert, tracking the small shifts of the camp, noting the morale and subtle tensions that rose like tides among the captives. He could not speak of the submarine without triggering a ripple of pain in the others, so he rarely did. Instead, he listened, observed, and occasionally offered counsel with minimal words. At night, alone in his bunk, Schlitt replayed the sinking of U-1206 in his mind as if it were a film with no end. Every detail returned with perfect clarity: the hiss of escaping air, the violent lurch of the hull, the sudden eruption of water and gas, the screaming men, the flash of bombs from the planes above. He could see Hans Meyer turning the demolition charges, his hands shaking yet precise, the young sailor who whispered prayers, the deck exploding into the stormy sea. The images haunted him with a precision that daylight could not erase. Yet over time, other memories began to intrude, the human moments drowned beneath trauma. He remembered the engineer's faint smile before the charge detonated, the trembling hands of the cook handing out meager rations, the young men's quiet jokes in the narrow corridor before disaster struck. These were the fragments that refused to be lost, the proof that life had existed in the belly of the beast. One afternoon, a rumor spread through the camp: the wreck of U-1206 had been spotted by a fishing vessel off the coast. The men clustered near the fence, straining to see the horizon through the gray haze. Some thought they could glimpse the twisted metal, the black outline of the hull barely visible through mist and tide. Schlitt did not join them. He knew the truth of what lay beneath, the cold, indifferent water holding the remains of men and machine alike. No glimpse would change that reality. At night, he stood alone outside the barracks, staring at the dark sea that stretched toward an invisible horizon. The wind carried the scent of salt and seaweed, a reminder of all that had been lost. The ocean did not speak of heroism or failure, it simply existed, eternal and unyielding. Schlitt understood, finally, that his obsession with the machine, the toilet, the errors of judgment, was less about guilt and more about witness. He had survived where others had not, and survival imposed a burden heavier than the dead themselves. In the weeks that followed, the prisoners were moved farther inland, away from the coast. The sea became memory, distilled into dreams, nightmares, and stories whispered in the barracks. Schlitt found himself sought after by other officers for guidance, for counsel, for reassurance that the worst could be survived. He gave what he could, but the truth was untranslatable. How could one explain the absurdity, the terror, the mix of ingenuity and error that had doomed U-1206? Letters arrived occasionally, censored and brief, from families who did not yet know the fate of their sons. Schlitt read them quietly, folding them carefully and returning them to his locker. Each envelope carried hope he could not provide and sorrow he could not mitigate. Some nights, he dreamed he was back aboard the submarine, descending into the abyss. This time, however, he was not alone. The men who had perished were with him, faces calm, eyes clear, moving through the corridors that had once been suffocating. The pressure was immense, the darkness complete, but there was no fear. In the dream, he understood that the sea had taken them, but it had also preserved something, a fragment of truth, of history, of human endeavor. When he awoke, his bunkmates stirred, unaware of his inner revelation. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, carrying the cold scent of coming winter. Schlitt dressed and moved through the camp with practiced detachment. Each step echoed with memory, each breath a reminder that life continued beyond the grave of his submarine. Eventually, word came that the war had ended. Germany had surrendered. Prisoners were to be released, returned to a shattered homeland. Schlitt did not feel relief. Freedom was a hollow victory. The sea had already claimed his men, his command, and a part of his soul. He would carry them in memory for the rest of his life. As the prisoners boarded transport for repatriation, Schlitt lingered at the edge of the camp, looking toward the distant horizon where land and water blurred. He thought of U-1206, resting beneath fathoms of cold, indifferent waves, and of the absurd mechanism that had brought the vessel to ruin. The irony was almost unbearable. He asked himself silently, would history remember them? Would it recall the bravery, the meticulous discipline, the fatal error? Or would it dismiss the story as absurd, a footnote about a toilet that drowned a submarine? He did not know, and perhaps that was the point. Memory belonged not to history, but to those who survived. The transport vehicle arrived, engines rumbling like a distant storm. Schlitt boarded with the others, wrapped tightly against the chill. As it pulled away from the camp, he took one last look at the gray expanse that had once been his world, his battlefield, and his undoing. He could almost hear the sea whispering beneath the hills, calling the names of the lost, holding them in the eternal silence below. He closed his eyes and let the wheels carry him forward, leaving the past behind yet never truly free from it. Back in Germany, the world Schlitt returned to was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, streets cratered by bombs, smoke still curling from fires that refused to die. The survivors of U-1206 disembarked from transport into a country that no longer existed in memory, only in fragments of rubble and ash. Families waited at stations, faces pale and strained, some with hope, some with fear. Schlitt's own family had survived, though the relief he felt was tempered by an emptiness he could not name. The war had ended, yet nothing was over. Even home smelled foreign, the air tinged with smoke, soot, and the bitter tang of loss. He walked the streets with measured steps, aware that every passerby bore their own burdens, though none had seen the abyss he had witnessed. The faces of the men he had commanded haunted him. He remembered Otto Klein, young and innocent, coughing and choking in the chlorine haze. He remembered Hans Meyer, precise, loyal, and lost to the explosion. Their absence was a weight that pressed against him even in the sunlight. Questions lingered. What would the world think? Could a single mechanical failure, a misplaced turn of a valve, define courage, failure, and fate? He doubted anyone would understand. Survivors carried the story with them, but most could not speak of it without tremor. In private rooms, he recounted events in fragments to others who had survived. The words felt inadequate, each sentence insufficient to capture the terror, the absurdity, the intimacy of the ordeal. It was not enough to say the submarine sank. It was not enough to name the mechanism, to explain the gas, the surfacing, the aircraft, the scuttling charges. History demanded precision, yet the human heart demanded emotion. Schlitt struggled to reconcile the two. The German Naval Command, now diminished and humiliated, offered a perfunctory debrief. Officers listened, nodded, filed papers. Some shook their heads in disbelief. A few offered condolences, though whether for the lost men or for the embarrassment of the event remained unclear. The story of U-1206 became a quiet legend, whispered in corridors and mess halls, a submarine undone not by enemy fire, but by the irony of human invention. Sailors told it to each other in hushed tones, half laughing, half awed. The toilet that sank a U-boat, they called it, the phrase repeating like a dark refrain. Schlitt refused to join in the humor. He understood the truth. It was not a joke, it was a tragedy, layered with discipline, failure, and chance. In the months that followed, he returned to civilian life, attempting to rebuild a world that had been shattered. Jobs were scarce, cities still smoked, and memories were a burden heavier than any rationed meal or collapsed building. At night, he would dream of the North Sea. The water never forgave, it merely remembered. He saw the hull of U-1206 twisting in the depths, its shape both precise and grotesque. Men moved within it like ghosts, preserved in memory, in metal, in pressure. He imagined their voices calling to him, not with anger, but with acknowledgement. That the living survived while the dead waited silently beneath the waves. Occasionally, journalists sought him out, eager to chronicle the story. They pressed for details, the absurdity of the malfunction, the heroism of the crew, the mechanical sequence that led to disaster. Schlitt answered cautiously, careful not to trivialize the event, careful not to sensationalize. He spoke of courage, fear, and chance. He spoke of the sea, indifferent and eternal. He left them with fragments, knowing they would fill in the rest with imagination. Scholars and naval engineers studied the records years later. They debated valve sequences, pressure differentials, chlorine exposure. They calculated what went wrong, what could have been done differently. But no calculation could capture the human element: fear, panic, loyalty, hesitation. These were variables that could not be quantified, only witnessed. Schlitt visited memorials erected for sailors lost during the war, sometimes seeing a name he knew, sometimes seeing none at all. He thought of his men, the ones who had died, and those who had survived with him. Memory became a sacred duty, a form of justice that history could not provide. In quiet moments, he would sit by the coast, staring at the horizon where the sea met sky. He imagined U-1206 resting in the depths, twisted metal and gas-filled compartments now silent. Yet he also imagined the souls of the men who had served, their courage preserved beneath the waves. The irony of the toilet, once absurd, had become a symbol of fragile human pride and the unexpected consequences of complexity. The sea, ever patient, had leveled the scales. Years passed, and Germany slowly rebuilt itself from the ashes of war, yet Schlitt carried the echoes of U-1206 like a shadow that refused to fade. He settled in a small town near the Rhine, the river's slow current a quiet contrast to the violent North Sea he had survived. Each morning he walked along its banks, observing the water's gentle flow, wondering if it, too, remembered. Perhaps all water remembered. Perhaps all memory was bound by liquid, by the capacity to hold what the eye could not see. He rarely spoke of the U-boat. When asked, he gave measured responses, recounting only the broad strokes: the patrol, the engagement, the sinking. He omitted the absurd details: the toilet, the flooding, the chlorine gas, that would have invited ridicule rather than understanding. Yet within him, every moment of those final hours remained vivid, each echo as sharp as the first cry in the flooded compartments. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, ears ringing with the hiss of escaping air and the roar of the explosion. His dreams were vivid reconstructions: corridors filling with water, men clinging to metal, the flash of bombs above, the cold embrace of the sea. He would wake and sit silently, staring at the ceiling, waiting for his pulse to return to its measured pace. Other survivors fared differently. Some married, had children, attempted to forget. Others could not escape the memory and drank to dull the relentless recall. They exchanged letters, occasionally meeting to speak in the quiet corners of cafes or private homes, sharing fragments of memory that could not be found in books. In these meetings, the absurdity became a kind of relief, a shared understanding that life had been chaotic, arbitrary, cruel. Historians would later study U-1206 not for its design flaws but for its human story: the courage, the fear, the loyalty, the fatal error. Schlitt's testimony formed the backbone of these accounts, though he always insisted that no technical report could convey the full measure of what had happened. At the Naval Museum, a scale model of U-1206 was displayed, meticulously crafted. Visitors admired its engineering, unaware that the greatest lesson lay not in the metal, the valves, or the pressure gauges, but in the human fragility that had been laid bare inside it. Schlitt once visited, quietly observing the model. He imagined the corridors, the deck, the compartments where men had struggled, fought, and died. The museum was silent, sterile, yet in his mind, the chaos persisted, alive and vivid. Occasionally, he found himself reflecting on the absurdity. Could one laugh at it? Could one accept that a simple mechanical failure, mundane and human, had determined the fate of so many? Perhaps. Humor, he realized, was a kind of reconciliation with the past, a way to bear witness without succumbing to despair. He allowed himself small moments of it, privately, in the form of a wry smile when recalling a particularly tense moment, or when telling the story to a trusted friend who could appreciate the grim irony. Yet the sea never left him. Even as he walked along rivers, lakes, or calm coastal shores, the North Sea's roar lingered in memory, indifferent and eternal. It had claimed his men, it had claimed U-1206, but it had also granted him perspective, and in that perspective lay both burden and clarity. Later in life, Schlitt occasionally received letters from young naval officers curious about U-1206, about submarine operations, about lessons learned. He answered as best he could, emphasizing caution, discipline, and respect for the machinery and the sea alike. But he also warned them about humility, the subtle dangers that even the most minor oversight could bring. "A man is not infallible," he wrote in one letter. "And the sea is patient." These letters became a quiet legacy, the passing of wisdom distilled through experience, tragedy, and survival. Communities honored the memory of the men lost aboard U-1206. Plaques were installed, names read aloud on anniversaries. Schlitt sometimes attended these ceremonies, silent among crowds of strangers and family members. He would listen to the names, the stories, the music, and feel a connection that was deeper than explanation. Each ceremony reaffirmed the permanence of memory, the need to honor those who could no longer speak for themselves. In private, he sometimes imagined the submarine itself at rest beneath the waves, the water moving gently over the wreckage, the steel slowly corroding, but the memory intact. He thought of the absurd toilet, the valves, the explosion, and the men who had trusted him. They were all still there, preserved in a way that history could acknowledge but never fully comprehend. One autumn evening, Schlitt walked along the Rhine, watching the sun set in blood-orange streaks across the water. The wind carried the scent of decay and growth, of endings and beginnings. He wondered if the sea remembered him as he remembered it, if it preserved the tiny details of survival and loss. Perhaps it did. Perhaps that was the gift it gave to those who endured. He closed his eyes and listened to the water, imagining voices in the depths, men calling his name, not in anger but in acknowledgement. He understood, finally, that the true legacy of U-1206 was not the vessel, nor the mechanism, nor even the tragedy itself, but the way memory could persist, how it could preserve courage, error, humanity, and absurdity alike. The story of the submarine would be told, retold, and reinterpreted over decades, becoming legend, history, cautionary tale, and human testament simultaneously. Schlitt remained alive to witness it all, a living conduit between the abyss and the world above. And when he finally looked at the horizon, beyond the steel bridges and the bustling ports, he could almost see U-1206 resting beneath the waves, its ghostly corridors empty, silent, yet alive in memory, a testament to human fragility, resilience, and the cruel, ironic hand of fate. Decades passed, and Schlitt grew older, the lines on his face deepened by memory and quiet contemplation. He never remarried, nor sought comfort in the noise of society. The events of U-1206 had carved a space inside him that could not be filled. He walked the banks of rivers and coasts, always drawn to water, the same element that had claimed his command, his men, and so much of his certainty. Letters and books preserved fragments of the story, yet nothing could convey the full weight of human error, bravery, and absurdity. Visitors occasionally sought him out, journalists, historians, former naval officers. They asked questions, pressing for technical explanations, heroics, and anecdotes. He answered carefully, always precise, yet always aware that words alone could never capture the terror, the panic, the small courage of men trapped in steel as the ocean surged. He spoke of Hans Meyer, the young sailors, the explosion, the scuttling, and the silent abyss below. He spoke of the absurd toilet, not to mock, but as a symbol of human frailty and pride, of how the smallest error could determine the fate of many. Some laughed uneasily, others nodded, understanding the lesson beneath the irony. Schlitt spent hours reflecting on memory itself. How fragile it was, yet how enduring when preserved by witness. The men who died aboard U-1206 were gone, yet through him, through letters, testimonies, and ceremonies, they remained alive in history and imagination. He often imagined them beneath the waves, not as victims, but as eternal witnesses to the strange interplay of human ingenuity and natural force. Occasionally, he allowed himself to smile at the absurdity, to recognize the dark humor that life sometimes imposed. Yet, even in laughter, the sea lingered, patient and silent. He pondered mortality, legacy, and the limits of human understanding. The North Sea had taught him lessons no classroom or book ever could: humility, respect, and the constant awareness that control is always an illusion. Machines, men, and even courage could falter, leaving only memory and consequence. He wondered if the men who had served alongside him ever fully reconciled with their own survival or loss. Did they, like him, feel the weight of absence in every breath, in every quiet moment beside water? Or had time allowed them a kind of forgetting that he could not permit himself? When he visited memorials, he often lingered longer than others, tracing names with fingers trembling from age and remembrance. Each plaque, each carved letter, each commemorative stone was a tether to the past, a link to men who had trusted him, who had faced fear, and who had perished under circumstances so absurd yet unavoidable. He recalled the young sailor who prayed, the engineer who obeyed, the deck flooded with salt and metal, the plains above. The memories were precise, cinematic, unavoidable. Even when he tried to rest, the images returned, not as nightmares, but as testimonies. In the evenings, he sometimes returned to the coast, watching the waves lap against rocks, imagining the submarine lying silently beneath, corroded, broken, yet permanent. He thought of the mechanisms, the valves, the toilet, the absurd smallness of human failure that had commanded such consequence. And he understood, with clarity both cruel and necessary, that the story was larger than metal, larger than war, larger than his own guilt. It was about human fragility, courage, absurdity, and the unpredictable hand of fate. Children played nearby, oblivious to the lessons beneath the waves. Schlitt observed them quietly, imagining their futures, the possibilities and mistakes to come. He thought of how even small actions could cascade into irrevocable consequence. He wondered, as he often did, what lessons they might carry into adulthood. Perhaps some would understand the fragile balance of human endeavor, perhaps some would never see it. Regardless, the sea remained, constant, a silent witness. On the anniversary of U-1206's loss, Schlitt visited the coast alone. He carried a small folded flag, one of the few reminders of the men he had commanded. He placed it gently in the surf and watched as waves embraced it, carrying it out toward the horizon. He whispered names, not to the wind or the water, but as a form of communion, a reminder that the dead remained present through memory. He thought of the irony again, a vessel undone by something so trivial, so human, yet preserved in history because of courage and consequence. The flag drifted away, but he felt it tethered, just as memory tethered those lost to the living. The sun dipped low, casting orange and gold across the water. Schlitt lingered, absorbing the quiet majesty, the patience, and indifference of the sea. In that moment, he felt a measure of peace, not because loss was resolved, but because memory endured. U-1206, its crew, the absurdity, the tragedy, all would remain, preserved in the minds of those who had witnessed, those who would retell, and those who would learn. He turned inland slowly, knowing that the sea would wait, as it always did, and that the story of U-1206 was now part of something eternal, the legacy of human courage, error, and the quiet persistence of memory. The ocean below, indifferent yet knowing, kept it secret, carrying it forever in dark depths where time did not matter. And Schlitt walked on, alive among the living, bound to the past, witness to a story that would never be forgotten.